Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. When it comes to the world of beat 'em ups, few games in the genre are quite as memorable and iconic as that of Sega's Golden Axe. Inspired by the likes of Conan the Barbarian and The Lord of the Rings, the game by Altered Beast creator Makoto Uchida would make a huge impact as one of the greatest brawlers of the 16-bit era. While many of the game's follow-ups would be cut from the same mould, offering up further beat 'em up escapades, other entries in the series would be cut from a different cloth, such as the Sega Saturn's fighting game known as Golden Axe The Duel being a prime example of this. Some entries though would stray even further from the source material, with today's subject matter perfectly illustrating this. Today we shall be exploring an offshoot of the extremely popular original game, one of which walks a very different path. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Golden Axe Warrior. That time Sega decided to turn Golden Axe into a Legend of Zelda ripoff. Yeah! Released in arcades during 1989, Golden Axe was met with extremely favourable reviews by those across the gaming world. The game was primarily designed by the legendary Makoto Uchida, who, gameplay mechanics wise, was inspired by games such as the Kunio-kun and Double Dragon series, franchises we have also looked at in depth on here in the past. Combining these mechanics with his love for action films, particularly the Conan franchise, would lead to something truly special. Let's be fair, the man had good taste. Who doesn't love seeing the future governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, crushing enemies in a loincloth? It is truly an inspiring sight. Bringing this imagery to arcade video game form resulted in a title that was popular enough to earn itself a whole host of home ports. Players adored the magical gameplay and stunning graphics, all accompanied by a gem of a soundtrack that still sounds fresh to this day. Golden Axe became a true icon in the genre. While the original game would be converted to run on the 8-bit Sega Master System, 1991's sequel simply titled Golden Axe 2 unfortunately was not. Instead, Sega Master System owners would be treated to their very own exclusive entry, one of which channels the spirit of a very different game, the NES's classic known as The Legend of Zelda. As disclosed, Makoto Uchida was responsible for the original arcade classic. This surprising change in the pace for the franchise though was developed at Sega with a completely different team than the one that worked on the original. This new squad included names such as Hikaru Takeo Kawaguchi, who went on to achieve varying degrees of success in the video game industry. Hikaru, for example, only ever worked on 2 titles, including the awesomely bizarre Alex Kidd in Shinobi World. Takeo Kawaguchi, on the other hand, had a longer and more distinguished career, working on games such as the Phantasy Star series, Mickey's Castle Evolutions and Sonic Fighters. To better reflect his great track record, I guess maybe we should forget about that last one. Anyway, Hikaru and company set about designing a game that took place within the Golden Axe universe, but not utilising the gameplay formula that made those games so popular in the first place. Rather than developing another beat 'em up for the series, they would decide to tackle the action-adventure and RPG genres instead, which may sound crazy, but I guess it is also important to mention that with Makoto Uchida's original brawler, he was also partly inspired by the myths and magic found in Dragon Quest, so I guess the more RPG based mechanics and layout found in this one echoes back to some of the very original inspiration. So if you're going to make a more action orientated role playing game where players get to swing weapons around, what better way of tackling this genre change than essentially copying one of your rivals' biggest releases ever, right? Yes, viewers, the team turned their attention to Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda for ideas, apparently taking a little bit too much inspiration for the seminal NES classic. Golden Axe Warrior borrows heavily from the then 5-year-old Zelda in a multitude of ways, making this look like a thinly veiled clone rather than a full-blown original intellectual property. Both games utilise a top-down view for the action, with the game world being split into over 200 screens or scenes that are changed when the player reaches the edge of said screen. This method of presentation and navigation alone is clearly a carbon copy of Nintendo's game, although it may just be a case of the developers paying homage to their predecessors. This would be more believable if Golden Axe Warriors wasn't so blatant in its duplication of Zelda's mechanics, and as we go further into our analysis, this shall become more and more obvious. First, let us tackle the plot of this often forgotten game. The evil and malevolent force from the original Golden Axe, Death Adder, is once again causing despair and anguish wherever he travels. This time he has brought death and destruction to the lands of Firewood, Nendoria, and Altarulia, killing the royal families of each province. Death Adder was able to do this because he had corrupted one of the royal ministers of Firewood, convincing them to sell the 9 royal crystals that prevent Death Adder from performing his dark magic. Ironically, the minister sold the crystals to Death Adder himself, which is not exactly what you would call a cunning plan. I wonder if his name was Baldric. After that scoundrel Adder had purchased the crystals and killed off the royal family, he hid them in 9 monsters and trap-filled labyrinths that are dotted around the overworld, hoping that no would-be heroes would discover them. For if they are discovered and utilised, then that would spell the end of Death Adder's reign of terror. I think you can see where this is all going. To kick things off when setting off in an adventure in this one, at the very start of the game the player is charged with naming their hero, another occurrence seemingly pilfered from Nintendo's Zelda. There are obviously many other games that allow the player to name their character. However, this, in conjunction with the other similarities we've mentioned, really does give the game an almost eerie Zelda vibe. I mean, if you were a big fan of Zelda, but only had a Sega Master System, what were you supposed to do? Wait for Nintendo to make one? I guess Master System does what Nintendo does. Similarities can in fact be seen throughout. They even use the same staircase tiles to denote where a new area is, a la Zelda. It's really rather shameful in some ways. Link in this game, or whatever you want to call this jabroni, is the resident of the recently ransacked Riverwood Kingdom, and he sets out on a mission of revenge aiming to destroy Death Adder in the name of his ruined childhood home and his murdered parents. Gosh, Death Adder really is a complete bastard. In order for the player to defeat Adder, they need to collect those 9 healing crystals from the various labyrinths that we mentioned earlier. These labyrinths are hidden across the map and each contain many puzzles and enemies that need to be overcome. Basically, if you have played Zelda, you will already be familiar with all of this. Throughout the game, there are also several villages and settlements that the player character can utilise to aid them on their quest. These villages provide the player with information as to the potential location of the various labyrinths, as well as useful weapons, items and heals to aid in the adventurer's journey. It is in these villages that the player will also encounter several familiar faces, especially if one has played the original entry in the Golden Axe series. The swordsman from the first game, the brilliantly named Axe Battler, appears and offers words of encouragement and advice to the player, as well as the other characters from the past also making appearances, such as the sexy Tyris Flare for example. This is an attempt to link the game to the other more typical entries in the series, and it is very welcome indeed. Despite these efforts, this still just does not feel like a Golden Axe game at all, and these little reminders honestly make you wish you were in fact playing those fabled original titles. Well, playing those or the original Zelda that this game desperately wishes it was. As the player character battles his way through the many screens of combat, he comes across the ability to purchase and gain magical powers. These magical spells are linked to the elements, minus wind, and provide powerful attacks alongside the basic weaponry on offer. Earth, fire, water and thunder magic are all available, giving the player a nice variety of ways with which they can dispatch Death Adder's monstrous creations. Unlike the other more popular Golden Axe titles, you do not have to kick and rob dwarves in order to cast magic spells. Not being able to kick little people though kind of takes a lot of the fun out of all of this really. Utilising these magical talents makes the 9 mandatory labyrinths a fun enough task to complete, although that may have more to do with the fact that you are playing a reasonable replica of the original Zelda, rather than any particularly unique gameplay, that of which this one has on offer. Like Zelda of course, at the end of the dungeons are bosses that need to be slain in order for you to claim the related crystal. As the player undertakes the liberation of the crystals, more of the story is revealed through the interactions with NPCs. It turns out that the Princess of Firewood, Princess Tyris Flare, escaped the butchering of her family by Death Adder. It is waiting upon the arrival of the Golden Axe Warrior to bring peace to the world once more. The Golden Axe Warrior was the person who stopped an ancient war between giants and elders with his giant Golden Axe. An imaginative title then, I'm sure you agree. Alongside the revelation of the princess's survival, another bombshell is dropped on the player. It turns out that the player character is in fact a member of the royal bloodline, a long lost descendant of the king of Alterulia. This reveal means that the player character is now destined to defeat Death Adder with the power of the Golden Axe, obtained after the last crystal has been captured. Once the last one has been obtained and the Golden Axe is in hand, the player can then head to the last labyrinth that has been unreachable until this point. Apparently, Death Adder has manufactured himself an evil genius base under the sea, like any decent Bond villain should. Death Adder is not as tough as his reputation suggests, and he is dispatched with relative ease by the player. Once the buff Death Adder has been defeated, it is revealed that all of the land celebrates wildly, as they are no longer under the thumb of this oppressive tyrant. I can't help but imagine the celebration scene in Star Wars after my boy Sheev Palpatine was beaten and we are shown cannibalistic Care Bears celebrating his downfall. I will never forgive George Lucas for removing the Yub Nub track. Ghost Hayden Christensen? What was he smoking? Sadly, in Golden Axe Warrior, all we got is some scrolling text, although I suppose that is very Star Wars in itself. The game's story concludes with the recently freed lands united under the rule of Princess Tyris, ushering in a new age of peace and prosperity for the entire world. The Golden Axe is hidden away in a place that is apparently out of reach of mere mortals and evildoers, making sure that the next Golden Axe Warrior has a similarly tough task at obtaining the only weapon that can destroy evil, leading to an ending that I guess is less sensical than even the Rise of Skywalker. Yuck. Upon release, Golden Axe Warriors received mixed reviews ranging from derision to celebration. Some publications such as GamePro and RPG Fan gave the title 5 out of 5 and 94% respectively, with the latter making the rather bold claim that Warrior is the superior game when compared to The Legend of Zelda. Other reviewers such as Meme Machines gave the title a rather paltry 40%, claiming that the game was boring and tedious. IGN mentioned the game many years after release, stating that it is one of gaming's most blatant rip-offs of all time. This highlights just how mixed the reception was, and continues to be, for this often forgotten important piece of Master System's history. Overall though, there is no denying that the game possesses nice graphics for the hardware running it, an okay story, and pretty lackluster music. I recommend any Golden Axe or Zelda fan to give this game a play for themselves, even if it's just for the novelty of playing what is essentially Sega's reworking of the Nintendo classic. The curiosity and intrigue that this game presents players allows Golden Axe Warrior to command a hefty price tag, which is higher than the majority of Master System games. Despite Sega's 8-bit machine being one of the cheaper retro consoles to collect for, Golden Axe Warrior sells regularly for upwards of £200 on eBay. Thank God I began collecting games with the system around the boot sales back in 2002. I believe I only paid about 50 pence. These days it has become increasingly common for complete morons to pay silly prices for regular games. I on the other hand built my 3,000 strong gaming library for peanuts, but unfortunately not all of you are quite as smart and insightful as me. But if you're a sensible person who never found a copy of this for cheap back in the day, I highly recommend you emulate this oddity instead. After all, we do not want to push up the retro gaming market any higher now, do we? That would be quite frankly absurd. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was the story of Golden Axe Warrior, the blatant Legend of Zelda ripoff that was available on the Sega Master System. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure you like it, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and leave a comment regarding your thoughts. I have plenty of other videos covering Golden Axe history and the beat 'em up genre in general, including individual videos on the Sega Mega Drive Golden Axe trilogy and Golden Axe the Duel for the Sega Saturn, so make sure you check all of those out. My videos are partially funded by the fantastic people who back this channel on Patreon, and each week I try to answer a different question from a different Patreon backer. And this week I have a question from Dan Barlow Jr., who posted on my Patreon saying, knowing how yourself and Lady Decade, my wife, get so much enjoyment from handhelds, do you fear that Analog Pocket may be one of the last handheld systems released? My answer to that question, I guess, is going to be a big, fat no. Whilst gaming as a whole seems to be evolving all the time, such as we got the Nintendo Switch, for example, which is a hybrid handheld / regular home console, I feel that when it comes to the retro gaming market specifically, they will always make up new pieces of technology that cater to this market. As highlighted earlier, when you take into the equation the rate at which games are continuing to go up in value, it only makes sense to continue to develop products that will interest us, because as you can see, people are willing to throw a lot of money around these days. Come on, look at that game I was talking about earlier. I paid 50p for Golden Axe Warrior. Now for some reason, idiots are choosing actively to pay 400 times what I paid for it. For what reason? Because they came late to the party. What blithering fools. Anyway, hope you enjoyed that answer, and I will see you all again soon. Yeah, cheerio.